You can see all the back end of me recording stuff. All right, so when you pull it open for the first time, it's going to usually bring up this stupid menu. I hide this. It's just it'll pull up like models you've used previously if you need to use them. But I find it very distracting. So first thing I usually do is can't really do much without a model in here. So normally what you're going to do is model your thing in Maya and then bring it into ZBrush to sculpt on. So if you look in the upper right, there's this import tool. I'm going to click on that. It's going to be where do you want to go? Where is your file? I will find my face file. And then I'm just going to click and drag. And you can see based on how I drag and the position of my mouse, it changes the orientation of the character. Never found this to make a lick of difference. If I put it in crooked and then I export this, put it back into Maya, still comes in straight at the angle that I put it in. Yep.
Do you want to export that as a FBX?
I think you can. Honestly, I've never tried, but you should be able to. What you could, I'm sure there's a way to do it. If you needed a cheap workaround, you could just throw it as export as an OBJ, put it into Maya, and re-export as an FBX. But I'm sure there's some kind of plugin or something that allows you to do it. I just don't know what it is off the top of my head. Are you, I guess, game? Is that?
No.
Or just curious?
I just want to know
Fair.
if there's a preferred format, OBJ over Maya scene or whatever.
Gotcha. I usually do everything in OBJs, just personally, but yeah, I don't really care what you guys use for stuff. My only preference would be use a Maya binary, or dear God, use a Maya ASCII file, not a Maya binary file. Apart from that, I don't super care. But yeah, so like I said, whenever you throw this head in, it's going to, the angle isn't really going to make a difference at all. If you do export this and re-import it, it's still going to come be sitting flat like it was originally. So you'll notice if I keep clicking and dragging, it's just sort of populating the scene with a bajillion versions of a head. I'm going to go out on a limb and say this is not what you want. So if that's the case, I'm just going to undo all of these heads, which I went a little crazy putting in there. So I'm just going to throw my head back in. And then to prevent, multiple heads from just popping up every time you click, you need to click this little edit button up here in the upper leftish of your screen. That's going to allow you to actually draw on your model instead of drawing more heads. That make sense? Cool. If for some reason you ever find that that's grayed out and you can't access it, usually I'll just Control Z and re-add in my head, and that'll sort of unlock the button. Or if it's being really weird, I'll just start a new scene and put my head back in. It's not ideal, but there it is. So there's actually speaking of making a new document, for some reason they rearranged all their menus. So instead of having file edit on the very leftmost buttons like normal programs do, they put them a third of the way into the menu option. Don't ask me why. But edit, if you click that, it'll give you a slide bar of your undo counter. The undos in ZBrush are insanely powerful. It'll track literally hundreds of undos. So you can pretty much sculpt, a really complex dragon head or whatever and just undo all the way back to having nothing in your scene. If you want to. It's their undo counter is so intense they literally had to give you a slider to control it because no one wants to push Control Z 200 times. But yeah, that's my shtick on the edit, or the undo thing. It is lovely. So file, pretty standard. They have open save menus. One weird thing to be aware of, which I actually just realized the other day. So file and the document menu, they both have options for open and save. And each menu saves a different type of file, which is really weird. So the document is going to save a ZBrush document file. If you do file save from the file menu, it's going to save it as a ZBrush project file. So if you happen to save as a ZBrush project file from the file menu, and then you go to document open, and it doesn't show your file anywhere, don't freak out, it's not gone. The document menu just doesn't recognize project files, and you have to go to the file menu to open it. So if you're sure you saved your file, you're looking back for it and you're like, oh god, I don't see it, just try the other menu from whichever you're working on. It's really weird and quirky. I prefer ZBrush project files. It seems like they sort of save a little bit more data, but honestly, I use both pretty much interchangeably over the years, and I haven't noticed a significant difference in either. So any questions on that? All right. If you do need to make a new document, that is under the Documents tab, new doc here. I was looking under File, and I'm like, oh my god, where is it? And I couldn't find it when I first started using ZBrush, and then I would literally like close and reopen the program every time I needed to make a new document, which is awful. So again, new document is going to set up a new file for you. But yeah, that's pretty much all the weird quirks with like the upper menus. If any of you guys are actually like fiddling in ZBrush right now, you've probably noticed that there's different navigation from Maya. I'm sure there's like some way to change that. I just honestly have never tried. So by default, rotate. If you want to rotate around your object, you can use either the left or the right mouse button and just pretty much click anywhere not on your object and just drag around. That's going to rotate it for you. Panning is Alt, and again, left or right mouse button doesn't really matter. Just click somewhere not on your object when you do that. So again, panning is Alt, and then rotating is Control. I'm sorry, zooming is Control and the right mouse button. Control and left mouse button does masking, later things, but yeah. So again, those controls, rotating, just click and drag anywhere outside of your model. Panning, Alt, and then click and drag anywhere outside of your model. And zooming is Control, right mouse button, and that'll zoom. So that's pretty much navigating in ZBrush. I'm not gonna lie, if this is your first time doing stuff in ZBrush, you're probably just gonna flail around helplessly for like 20 minutes and be like, dear God, what are these controls? At least I did. I don't know. If you don't do that, you're like wizard people, and that's awesome. But yeah, that's basically the nav. Questions on nav? All right. It does honestly just take getting used to. And if you have so I'm actually used to using ZBrush with a tablet. If you guys happen to have access to like digital drawing pads, ZBrush does work with like pressure sensitive or like pen pressure sensitivity. And navigating in ZBrush is really easy with a tablet, should you have access to one, but obviously you can also use it without a tablet. I realize not everyone has tablets just laying around at their disposal. Anywho, moving on. So if you need to, so like when we went into Mudbox last week, we had to subdivide the mesh before we sculpted on it, because like, if I'm doing this, it's not really like giving me great resolution. Just kind of like bludgeoning my person's head awkwardly. So to subdivide the model in ZBrush, if you look on the right, there's this little menu list thing of different options. If you need to scroll in this, you just have to click in the menu and drag up and down. Scroll bar doesn't work. Don't ask me why. But if you go to the Geometry tab, you'll see this ginormous button that just like screams divide in your face. Clicking that will subdivide your model. You can see the number of subdivisions you've added up here on this little slider here. And you can also toggle back and forth between the different subdivisions if you want to like go back to the original level or like go back to the highest, whatever. So it's fairly straightforward. While I'm here, there's like these two buttons here. So delete lower and delete higher. These are going to basically get rid of subdivision levels. So delete lower, so I'm on subdivision 3 out of 5 right now. If I do delete lower, it's going to set subdivision 3 to basically the lowest resolution mesh I have. It's getting rid of all of those lower subdivisions of my original mesh. I don't think I've ever really used that for anything. It feels like a really dangerous option to me, especially if your computer starts lagging and you like can't go back to a lower resolution mesh. On the flip side, delete higher I do sometimes use. Like if ZBrush will freeze and I'll keep clicking divide and I'll have like 10 subdivisions and I'll be like, why have I done this thing? So if you do delete higher, it's just gonna get rid of all the subdivisions. Because if you realize like you don't need them, like just get rid of them. Like they're gonna slow your computer down. So like a lot of times I'll just sort of, again, just get rid of them. So that's delete lower, delete higher, and subdivision in general. Any questions on that? All right. I'm gonna divide this up to like, actually, yeah, what the heck. So to actually start sculpting on your model, it's actually really similar to Mudbox, and kind of like Photoshop as well. Over here you have your different brush options. So the first little tab drop-down menu thing, this shows you basically different functions of like how your brush is going to behave. So by default, the standard brush, I'm not going to go through all of these because that's just evil. So like standard brush, a little bit is like your default Photoshop brush, where it's just sort of like a circle with some fall off. If you look up here, sort of like upper middle-ish, you'll see these different settings. These are your brush settings. So like draw size obviously is going to change the size of your brush. Cool. Z intensity is going to change how far, basically like how intense the stamp or like doodle you're doing is. So if I set this down to like something super low, like 6, it's not really going to do all that much to my mesh. Compared to like 100 is going to make some like real funky effects. So this is like 6, 100, and like 50-ish for Z intensity. I think of that honestly a little bit like opacity in Photoshop. For some reason it just like works for my brain. And then focal shift is a little bit like your brush hardness. So setting that, bad example. So setting that lower is going to give you different effects on your model. You just like play around again to sort of get the effect that you want. So this is like a like -80 focal shift. It gives you a pretty hard line around the base of this, versus +48. It gives you a much softer transition between the stamp and the model head. So again, just like kind of play around, get what you need from that. Gonna undo all this glorious things. Yeah, so that's pretty much that. Any questions on that? All right. So there are a few brushes that I found helpful that I'm just gonna like really quick demo. So I use standard a lot just for like stamping things. I'm also a fan of the different clay brushes, like clay buildup, and clay tubes. So you can see they work a little bit differently from same brush settings, but they work a little bit differently from the standard brush. I do find clay is pretty nice if you do just sort of need to like lump up material, and it smooths down really easily if you need to. What have I done? The marvels of the ZBrush undo counter. But they have a bunch of other really weird stuff. They have like inflate. Like honestly, like I'll just, if I'm looking for something particular, I'll just go through and sort of like play with stuff until I find things that kind of does what I like. Chisel is like weird. It'll just works a little bit differently. It has like some smoothing on it, but it'll just like pretty aggressively cut out like a piece of your mesh. Crumple, some of the brushes just kind of like break your mesh, but like crumple is interesting if you just need like a really subtle, like this is like honestly pretty good for a rock texture if you just need like a basic something kind of that looks like broken and rocky. The other one that I think is really, really cool is, I can never find it in the menu, but it's H-Polish. If you're ever looking to make something that has a sort of like hammered metal look in it, you can use H-Polish, and it'll basically just sort of flatten the area that you're working with. And again, if you go through, you can just sort of like make these really weird, interesting effects, especially like on curved surfaces, stuff like that. But they're all pretty fun to play with. But again, I'm not going to go through all of them. Those are just sort of the ones in general that I use frequently and like. Obviously, there's like a bunch more you can play with. Some of them do really, really weird stuff. Like you can just draw and just like, you know, do whatever that is. There's better ways to do that in ZBrush, but you know, some of the brushes are pretty out there. That's pretty much that. If you want to smooth anything that you've done, there's two ways to do that. So you can find the smooth brush in here, which I honestly usually don't bother with because I can just never find it. Or you can hold down Shift. So if I press and hold Shift, you can see it'll toggle between my standard or like whatever brush I'm using and the smooth brush. It's also going to toggle between, So Shift has its own settings for like focal shift Z intensity, which you can adjust separately. So if I adjust Z intensity of smooth, release the Shift key, that's weird, usually it doesn't tie those together. There we go. So the value was highlighted, so I just unclicked, so the value wasn't like highlighted. And then that'll keep the Z intensity for smooth at 13, and the other one is still set to 100, so it's gonna like, it'll carry those settings with it basically. But so if you're using Smooth Tool, again, pretty much just go through and like smooth out parts of your mesh. Sometimes the effect isn't like entirely obvious what it's doing. So like right now I'm trying to smooth this area, but it's not really doing all that much. So you might need to go through and like help it with another brush. I find that sometimes the rake tool isn't too bad. For that you can just sort of like, oh god, but maybe not with Z intensity 100. You can just sort of go through and like scribble on your mesh, and then like when you smooth that, if you keep doing that, you can see that that's smoothing a lot better. It just sort of like primes the mesh a little bit to be modified with the smooth tool. H-polish is also not bad for that. If you just need to like round out, you can just sort of go over your whole mesh and it'll just like sort of mash the whole surface down. But yeah, so again, that's basically toggling between smooth and like whatever other brush you're using. Any questions on that? All right. Last thing I want to go over about basic brush settings. So you'll notice that by default, that is a hideous Z intensity. You'll notice by default it is adding material onto my mesh. So if I like draw, it's going to make a giant lump in the surface. If you want to carve material out instead, there's again 2 ways to accomplish this. So if you look up here, if you toggle between Z-add and Z-sub, Z-add is going to add material on, basically going to make raised stuff. Z-sub is going to make indents in your model. So again, wow, Z-add versus Z-sub, raised versus lowered. You can also toggle between these with the Alt key. So if you have Z-add, you're using that for most of your model, and you just need like a really quick thing to be engraved in your model. So again, I'm on Z-add. If you press and hold Alt as you draw, it's just going to toggle it really quick without needing to go and click in the menu option. It'll also work like literally mid-stroke. Like you can see, by toggling that, you can actually, that's actually not a horrible way to make stitches. It's a little awkward, but kind of works, sort of. But yeah, and if you happen to be on Z-sub, so like most of what you're doing is, you know, carving stuff, and then you just need like a quick add, you can still hit Alt. It's going to like switch between whichever one isn't currently active. It's just going to like make that one active for a few seconds. So again, mostly just like quick things to improve your workflow. So any questions on the like any of that stuff? Cool. This I'll come back to in a minute. But the same way, so like when we were in Mudbox, you had like little stamps and stuff you could put on your model. They have all of that in ZBrush. You just want to look under the Alpha tab. So I'm just going to say, cool, I kind of like this weird star. Make this bigger. I can stamp giant... Ooh. Actually, that kind of looks like a pastry if you reverse it. But like, I'm just going to stamp like giant stars all over my person's head. It's amazing. You can sub in like whatever alphas you want. There is actually also, if you need to import a custom brush, ZBrush makes that like stupidly easy. Literally just like down here, there's an import button. Click that, find, usually it'll be a TIFF file that you're looking for. And then it'll just like pull it up and you can use it. So if you guys are ever just looking for some brush textures, a lot of times I'll go into, if you go to like textures.com, they have sculpting brushes here. So you can see there's a bunch of different textures for like rocks and stuff like that. I do not remember my login at all, so I can't download these, which is annoying, but basically this is what a sculpting alpha brush looks like. It's just, you know, values for opacity, and the whiter areas are going to be more raised in your mesh, darker areas are going to have no effect on your mesh. But like if you find like rock textures, stuff like that, it's so much easier to sculpt in rocks than trying to like do it by hand with basic brushes in ZBrush. They also have really crazy brushes for just just like different random scrolly designs, like this kind of stuff. Holy crap, that looks so legit. Sorry. But like they have all these different brushes, which you can also download, and this is literally just going to stamp this pattern. Here's like a preview. It'll literally just stamp that onto your mesh. So it's really good if you're looking for a quick way to make some just like, you know, repeating designs on molding or something like that. You can use these brushes. Oh, example in ZBrush. But yeah, so it's like, again, really powerful to be able to import your own alphas. But they're pretty straightforward. Like the way they work is pretty straightforward. You know, they're just gonna like stamp an object, stamp a little pattern on your object. The other thing to be aware of, so ZBrush is interesting in the sense that, so right now to stamp these little areas, I'm left mouse clicking on my object, dragging slightly, and then it deposits my stamp onto my mesh. So again, I'm just clicking and dragging ever so slightly. If I drag in a different direction, so I've been taking and dragging towards the sort of bottom rightish of the screen. If I take and drag towards the bottom left or up, it's going to change the direction of my stamp. So it's just like an easy way to have a little bit more control over, like if you're trying to make something look a little bit less like a repeating pattern, you can just sort of vary the direction that your cursor is moving, and it's going to sort of randomize that pattern in a very controllable and predictable way. It's kind of just like thing to be aware of. So yeah, I mean that's pretty much alphas. You can go back in and, you know, etch this arrow into the person's head instead of adding it, kind of whatever. Any questions on that? All right. I'm gonna go back to my edit counter and just scrub back through some of these mods I've made. So that takes me back to this like little stroke thing here. By default, it's set to dots, which is a little bit pretty much like how Photoshop works with their brushes. But if I click and I drag this arrow texture, you can see that it's basically just like duplicating that texture over and over as I drag my brush, which isn't not great if you're trying to put like scales on something. And so they have like some kind of brushes that like kind of look like scales. Sure. So if I like drag this, it doesn't make a particularly realistic looking scale effect. It just sort of looks like a mushy something. I don't know. I don't know what that looks like, but it's not terribly appealing. Doing something where you like individually place each scale is like significantly nicer looking in the grand scheme of things. And there's like a few options for the stroke that will allow you to do that maybe a little bit easier. So the first one is spray, which doesn't necessarily make things nice, but if you do just sort of need like a pattern to just be like randomly slapped on your model a few times, spray will do that. It just sort of, again, just makes like weird sort of randomized clumpings of your mesh, or of your alpha stencil. The other one that I've actually found to be really, really helpful, particularly for placing stuff like scales, is drag dot. So that if I click on my model and then I drag, you'll notice instead of just repeating this pattern a bajillion times, it's just like allowing me to drag this all over the model. So it gives me a lot of control. Like I can, you know, lay it down and then go in and place it. And it's just like, again, a little bit more of a controllable way to work on stuff. So yeah, I mean, that's honestly, like, that's pretty much all I ever do with stroke. I haven't noticed a huge difference between freehand and dot. They both seem to behave like pretty much the same. And then color spray is a little bit similar to spray. Again, I find they pretty much work more or less the same. Drag rectangle, I literally never use ever. But yeah. So any questions on any of that? All right. That's pretty much the basics of sculpting on an object in ZBrush. There's like a whole heck of a lot of stuff you can do, and it has its own like really powerful modeling tools. That's just like not really what I'm going to be going over today. And honestly, mostly when I use ZBrush, it is for like sculpting on models that I've made elsewhere. So I'm actually just going to reset up the scene really fast. and then show you guys the process. There's like a few things that you need to do before you start sculpting if you want to actually use this as like a functional displacement map. So again, I'm just going to go to Document, New Document. I do not want to save my awkward lumpy head. And I'm just going to find my character mesh again, throw that in my scene, click Edit so I don't put in a million heads. And then the first thing I want to do before I start sculpting, if you know you're going to be exporting texture maps from this, over on this right menu bar, there's a drop-down called Morph Target. If you click into that, you want to click this Store MT button. Basically what this is doing is it's saving a copy of your mesh so that once you sculpt all over it, you have a copy of the original that is from Maya that you're presumably going to be rendering on, and it's going to tailor the displacement map for that model rather than the slightly modified sculpted version. Because if you sculpt the model like really crazy and then you go back down and look at the lower subdivision level, like the shape changes pretty dramatically. I'll show you guys that at the end, but pretty much for now, just like know that you need to go down to Morph Target and click Store MT before you start messing around with your model. So once that's done, if you ever forget to do this or you've like invested hours in a sculpt, there's like workarounds to do that, which I'll go over later. So don't like freak out if you forget to click that, but like totally try to remember to click that. It's definitely the safer option. Anywho, so once that's done, you can just go and subdivide your model like normal. And in this case, I think I might, I don't know. I always want to do something interesting with this, and then I'm just like, I lack all inspiration. So if you guys ever need, like, maybe I want to do symmetry on this, like if I wanted to like put on some weird sort of scales, or what is this? Ooh, veins, yes. Sorry, I get really spazzy when I texture stuff. So if you guys ever wanted to do like something symmetrical on the face, there's a symmetry option. If you go up to the top menu, like where File and Document is, almost all the way to the right, there's this Transform menu. And then towards the bottom of that, there's Activate Symmetry. So you can turn on symmetry if you want, and that's going to give you, it's going to allow you to stamp, holy crap, symmetrical things on your model. That is so bad looking. Anywho. So I might just be like, all right, maybe I want some like weird sort of veins on this face. I'm not gonna do anything like terribly nice looking right now. I don't know. You can get some fun. I do like veins on stuff. Veins are always fun. It's like such a good texture. Anyway, and then I'm just gonna go through it like really quick and do something like very obnoxious that's definitely gonna show up when we render this in Maya. So I usually end up drag dot her. That's not nearly obnoxious enough. All right, I'm just gonna put giant. That'll show up. All right, like I said, I do get really spazzy when I texture stuff. I don't know why. It's just fun. And then sometimes I end up just like sitting in ZBrush forever and just like doodling on my mesh with brushes like a crazy person, and it's just like oddly satisfying. But anywho, so assuming that I've made something that I'm happy with, or like turned myself into some combination of like Princess Leia and the devil. You can see it though, right? Like it's not just me. Anyway. But yeah, like I said, I get weird when I'm sculpting. It makes everything more fun. But anywho, so once I'm done with this, like if I like my sculpt, I'm just gonna go back to my geometry tab and slider my subdivisions all the way down to 0. And you can see that this has pretty aggressively affected my base mesh. So if I go back down to Morph Target, again, this is where this comes in handy. So when I hit Switch, like this is my original mesh. Where am I going? And this is the lowest poly version of the modified mesh. So again, it's a good idea, like especially if you're doing like really aggressive changes to your model like this, where like ideally those like weird head nubs I added would be like in the actual model. But yeah. So you can fudge it. Fudging it works a little bit better with displacements that aren't as aggressive as this, but basically I just want to hit switch and go back to my original model. And at this point I am ready to export my displacement map. So if you go down, there's another little tab for displacement maps. Just gonna click on that. The settings you want to click are, so adaptive, usually I don't click that. It makes a slightly nicer looking mesh, or slightly nicer looking map in the end. It'll give you like a tiny bit more resolution, but it also like quadruples your render time of the mesh, which I am far too lazy to deal with most of the time, and I don't find that the benefit of using it is like drastic enough to make me want to deal with that extra render time, so usually I don't select this. If you have issues with your map, like quality-wise, it might be worth going back and trying a render with it turned on, but normally, like as a tester, just like, unless I really need it, I'll just leave it off. Smooth UV is, you only need to check this if you're working with a model that's going to be smoothed with a 3 key in Maya. If you're doing like a low poly game mesh that's not being smoothed, you do not need to click this. In this case, I am going to be smoothing my head, so I will click this. Flip V you need to turn on. ZBrush does this weird thing where it'll export your map upside down unless you click this option. If you forget to click it, not a huge issue, just like flip it in Photoshop. But if you do this, then you don't need to do that. And then I'll usually check 3 channels. It just like converts the map to like RGB values. Sometimes if I have errors with it, I'll like try turning this on and off, and like sometimes it helps, but usually having it turned on works perfectly fine. And then definitely check on 32-bit. So this is going to be, to give you like a higher resolution map, give the computer more information to work with. Other things you want to turn on, so this DP subpix, displacement subpixel density, set that all the way up to 4. That's again going to give you a much nicer resolution mesh or map than the final version. So I also need to set this value to 0. I'm going to see what happens. All right, I'm going to try this and see if it breaks everything. All right. Sometimes it can, oh, this is going to be a long one. All right, gross. All right. Yeah, no. All right, so I'm just going to show you guys how to set this to 0. I'll explain what this is doing in a second, but to actually access this, you'll know it's grayed out by default. If you click on this big like texture window under displacement map, add in any random alpha you want, you'll see that'll actually give you access to this 0.5 mid button, and at which point you can set that to 0, and then just get rid of the alpha. Get rid of the alpha. So again, you definitely want to set this to 0, and then to access that, again, just add an alpha in here, fiddle with your slider, and then just get rid of the alpha. At which point you should be able to create and export a map. It'll ask you where you want to save it, and then it'll give you this wonderful preview up here of how long it is going to take to generate your mesh. Sometimes this is accurate, sometimes it is not. I do find that there's a few things that tend to make this render time go up. So, the more subdivisions you have in your model, or like if you're just working with a large model that starts with a lot of polys, like the more polys in your scene, the longer it's going to take to render the map. And then the more displacement you add, so like when I added those crazy horns, that it's going to have to do a lot of calculations for how to stretch the model that far in the displacement map compared to me just going in and like adding some subtle skin texture. So that's all stuff that's going to make your render times for your map go up higher. You'll notice like for this, since I did some really aggressive nonsense to it, it's estimated it's going to take like 11 minutes to finish rendering. So while it's doing stuff, I'm going to see what happens if I exit out. Yep, nope, that died. So here's an example of, this has like happened 99 out of 100 times that I go to do anything with my computer besides exporting the map from ZBrush. So like it'll literally like crash. Like the second I click out of the ZBrush window, ZBrush just dies. So once you go to export your map, leave the computer alone. Or at least save before you do that. it does tend to be relatively decent about giving you some save, like, here's like some, you know, it auto saves every once in a while, and a lot of times you can go back and get your files. In this case, I have like pre-exported displacement maps, so I'm just going to show you guys how to use those, but yeah. So one of the reasons I'm actually having you guys do stuff with ZBrush this week, it's the first time I learned it was in organic modeling, and like when you do stuff for Orgo, it takes like forever. When I say forever, I mean like 40 minutes to export a map, sometimes longer. So I'm like, hey, you guys should totally play with that now, so you don't need to worry about, like, if you're gonna fail and like mess up with settings and have your maps break, better to do it on like a 2 or 3 minute export than on a 40-minute export, because trust me, it sucks. So anywho, once ZBrush kicks out the file, it's gonna look something like, wait for it, something like this. This is like a weird lizard skin that I added onto my person. I was feeling a little eccentric. So this is the file that I'm going to use to show you guys how to plug in displacement. There are a few more settings you can use to like refine your map if it doesn't show up correctly. But yeah. So actually, while I'm here, that little mid slider, all that does is changes the background color of your displacement map. So I think I mentioned this before, but like when you guys are using a bump map, I said you should start with a value of 50% gray as the background, and then anything that's white is going to be raised, anything that's black is going to be like indented. Displacement maps don't quite work like that. Black is do nothing to the mesh, and honestly, I don't know how it calculates values of indentation. I think it's just like data that isn't shown normally, but the computer like registers as there. But if you do start with a 50% gray background, and that's what that little, the mid slider by default sets this to 50% gray, it's gonna like puff up your entire model and make it look ridiculous, which is why, again, you need to set that slider to 0. That's just saying, hey, background be black. But anywho, so I have this random scene that's like half set up, kind of. Sure, let's do a copper head. That seems like a terrible idea. All right. So again, I went over this before, like how to actually apply a displacement map. Basically, you just want to go into your hypershade and find your standard surface shader, expand it, click on this little dude here, and you'll see that there's a area where you can put in a displacement map. So I'm just going to find my file and map that in. Cool. So now the map should be attached in there. If I render this, hopefully it doesn't explode. I've had bad luck with computers crashing on me the last 2 days. I don't know why. But you can see it's sort of starting to do something, kind of. There's like the hint of something happening in here, but it's like very much doesn't look like my ZBrush sculpt, like at all. So if you guys ever have this issue, there's some more settings that you need to use, and it's similar between Arnold and Redshift to improve the way that this actually shows up. Kind of the same thing where you need to manually tell the object to be transparent. You need to go into the shape node, and if you scroll down under Arnold, there's a little tab for subdivision here. So I'm actually going to do this. So if I click on this, so the first thing for type, you want to set that to Cat Clark. Why is that looking? Oh, was this the broken one I did? Crap. All right. Basically, Cat Clark is, there's different ways, like different math calculations that computers use to smooth meshes. Cat Clark is the one that Maya uses and that many programs use. So again, that's the option you're using here. It's basically just like which math formula are you using to smooth your mesh. And then for iterations here, you want to set this to something a little bit higher. I found 3 to not be terrible. But it would seem like, I think, no, I didn't grab the wrong, this isn't like a TIFF, what is this? I might have actually just like grabbed the wrong file for my home computer. Everything kind of got broken. All right, new plan. It also deleted all my like useful files from yesterday. So again, I'm just gonna like speed run through making an ugly little displacement map that should actually export significantly faster. Draw and model, edit menu, morph target, store, geometry, subdivide, repeatedly. Huzzah. I'm just gonna sculpt on something that is not pretty. That's not helpful. Hiya. I just want something that's gonna have like a little bit of evident displacement. Go back to 0, or take your subdivisions back down to 1. Go back to morph target, switch that, and displacement map. Saved all my original settings except mid, so I gotta set that back to 0. Get rid of the alpha, and hopefully this exports faster. Or not, maybe, possibly. Alright, if this takes forever to export, I will say Mudbox is significantly faster at exporting displacement maps than ZBrush is. I just like sculpting in ZBrush so much more that I'll suck it up and just use it. But, yeah.
What is the function of morph target again?
So morph target, it'll go through, basically saves a copy of your mesh. So remember when I like did the crazy sculpting and went back to the lower resolution mesh, it had like the weird spiky stuff. So when you make the displacement map, like if I'm not using that like weird spiky model in Maya, what store morph target does is it basically stashes a copy of the original mesh that doesn't have the weird displacements applied to it. That's theoretically going to be the same model that you're using to apply the texture and render with. And it's going to tailor the map to fit that original mesh instead of the modified lower resolution meth with like crazy devil horns, if that makes sense. That answer the question? More or less? I mean, are there? All right, cool. Sorry. So there's actually, if you do happen to forget to hit morph target, what you can do, and it'll actually do it. I might just let this run through, but it'll do it after you export a map, where it's like, hey, do you want to export the base mesh from this? If you're using morph target, it's going to export like the same mesh you're already working with. If you forget to do morph target, it's going to export that lower resolution mesh with like the weird modifications on it. So in the case of that first thing I did where I added like Princess Leia horns to myself, you would want to use that new mesh because the map is going to work much better on that than the original, if that makes sense, because it is tailored. It expects to have like some pre-existing geometry and shape there, and if the model you're using doesn't have that, it's gonna be like, well, what the heck? So you can always just export the modified mesh and use that. It's just not ideal because like sometimes it'll modify it in a way where like if you're doing, especially if you're doing like a low poly game mesh, and you maybe like really don't want those like weird modifications because it's gonna be, the displacement map isn't gonna like render the volume change in engine kind of thing. So it is good again to actually use morph target, but if you don't, it's not like the complete end of the world. 10, 9, 8, all right. Anyone else have any questions while this is like doing its thing? All right. Haha. All right, so I have some kind of map. And you see here, it'll ask if you want to do the base mesh. If I didn't do store morph target, I'd probably say yes, but in this case, I do not care at all. So let us see what horrors it has generated for me. Beautiful. It's pretty much what I expected. So I'm just going to go back really quick and switch out the file that I made. There we go. And you can see that it's actually now rendering displacement in. Still kind of a wonky example because it's basically just like a lump on the head, but if I go into shape nodes, I'll get rid of the displacement stuff I did. And it tends to make a little bit less difference on models like this, where it's a fairly like large, low resolution lump that I'm adding to this head. It does help smooth it out a tiny bit, and And I have some actual like renders stashed on my Google Drive that show it a little bit more clearly, what that smoothing actually does. Again, it does work. It's mostly for like if you have really fine details and Maya's not quite capturing it. So here is, this is the map that I was like trying to import that was broken. I grabbed the wrong file. I did like 5 versions of this trying to like mess with settings. I think I grabbed the wrong one. Anywho, so this is like no smoothing, just the default map thrown into Maya. And if you look at, this is like the area where it's going to be most obvious. So once I turn on the Cat Clark smoothing, you can see that those scales show up like a little bit nicer on the side. And then once I add the subdivisions up to 3, you can see that there's a lot more resolution in the scales, and the side of the mesh is like much lumpier, I guess, which is how it appeared in my actual ZBrush sculpt. So again, if your mesh isn't like showing up with the resolution you expect, you want to go in and play with this smoothing. And also as a weird sort of silly example, so remember that thing, like the first, not that, the first day of class when I was like going over all of this stuff that you shouldn't do, and I was like, don't use a cube to make a round object. I like impersonating myself in like ridiculous voices. I don't know why. So like, if you look at this, again, it smooths like really, really gross. The edges are like super lumpy and just like low poly looking. If I go in here and, again, shape node, I'm just going to go down onto the Arnold tab and subdivisions. As soon as I set this to Cat Clark, you can see that it does start smoothing a little bit nicer. And then if I bump the subdivs up to 3 instead of 1, it's going to look even better. It's like, even with this, you can still see there's like a little bit of polylines. I hit 3 and they pretty much go away. So if you ever are like in a pinch and you need, this would be better for stuff like, I did that little grate demo where I like booled a bunch of rectangles together and made like a grate with a bunch of little round holes out of a square holes. Something like that. If you had to get up close, you could like fudge the subdivisions with this. But ideally, if you need to actually model a sphere, like make a sphere. But if you ever need to fudge it, it's like way too much effort to add in, like, again, those like little holes. You could just kind of cheat it with this a little bit. But yeah. So any questions on that for Arnold? All right. If that's the case, I'm gonna